All right, guys, what's going on? So it's a beautiful day. I feel like I got super lucky coming out here and doing this today. It's nowhere near as cold as I thought it was gonna be. It's only like 55 degrees, so it's actually like perfect to come out here and get a nice ruck in. Nice, beautiful sunshine, and the only thing I'm worried about is the wind. It's been a little on and off windy out here, so hopefully that doesn't interfere with this video too much. I'm sorry if it does. But hey, so if you guys have been following the last few videos, this video is gonna be another continuation on the, I don't know, my military story series. And this video is going to be all about my experience with my very first deployment downrange, my very first combat deployment downrange. And while I'm out here enjoying this beautiful weather, getting myself a nice ruck in, I'll be reminiscing the times of old and recalling as much as I possibly can about my first deployment, because that was about 15 years ago from now, and a lot's happened since then. I've had to brain dump a lot of information. I'm getting older. I feel like I just kind of have been starting to forget more and more things from back then, so I'm gonna do my best to remember as many details that I can share with you about the experience, and hopefully that will give you a little bit of insight and a little bit of maybe motivation, and it'll just be a good way to provide a little bit of mentorship to you guys. Now, I can already tell you right now, right off the bat, that this is not going to be a story about, you know, extreme combat or heroism or, you know, anything that would probably be worth making a movie of, you know what I mean? So if that's what you're thinking you're going to get out of this, I can tell you this isn't the video for you. My first deployment story is much more real world. It's much more real life. And honestly, I think it's gonna be a lot more relatable to the majority of combat deployment stories out there during the time of the global war on terrorism. In other words, what my deployment was like is what the majority of combat MOS deployments were like in Afghanistan back in those days. And you might be surprised to hear it, but you know, during that time, combat deployments were mostly extremely boring. Mostly boring, and then accentuated with, I think I've used that word right, accentuated with extremely small periods of time of excitement. So what I'm gonna try to do is attempt to convey to you what a combat deployment back then was like overall, and then I'll kind of try to reminisce and try to remember some of those accentuated moments for me specifically, and hopefully it all makes sense for you and comes together and the story comes out clear. So it was back in the middle of 2009, the summer of 2009, when me and the rest of my CAV unit got all packed up, had our last 2 weeks of block leave, and got on the bird to deploy to Afghanistan. We were a brand new unit. Our unit as a whole, this was the first time the unit had ever deployed. But the unit consisted of a whole bunch of brand new troops and experienced troops. So it wasn't like the first deployment for everybody going. But it was definitely the first deployment for me. And I was still, you know, a cherry Cav scout at the time. I was a specialist, and I was excited, but also pretty nervous because I really just didn't know what I was getting into. You know, I thought it was just gonna be combat left and right, and I didn't even know if I was gonna be coming home. And this was the time of Obama's second surge, so it was, there was a big surge of American troop activity pushing into Afghanistan at the time, mostly to support security for the elections that were happening around that time. And so that was really what our unit was called to do. Initially, we were actually supposed to go to Iraq, but then kind of last minute, I want to say it was maybe a month before we deployed or 2 months before we deployed, we found out we were going to Afghanistan instead. So we had been training for the last 2 years, getting ready to go to Iraq, and then everything shifted last second and we went to Afghanistan. Luckily, the two theaters aren't all that different, so it wasn't a huge shock to us overall. It wasn't too big of a deal. And leading up just before that deployment, I had just gotten the wife pregnant. And it wasn't an accident. We did that on purpose. You know, I mentioned that on the last video with this series, but that she was pregnant right before I left for deployment. And we already together had 3 kids at the time too, so we knew that this was gonna be difficult, and times were a lot different back then. You know, I wasn't gonna have a cell phone. I wasn't gonna have internet, at least not readily available to me. In fact, when I got there, I don't even think I made a phone call for the first couple months or something like that. The best you had back then was a prepaid phone card, and you had to go to a specific MWR phone center downrange, which they only had a few of them at the time. Back in those days, they were only located in the main fobs, the big fobs. And our unit, our cav unit, was not going to be deploying to a big fob, a big established place. We were going to a place that was not built up at all until we got there. So you can imagine how limited the communication was between me and my wife. Even though she was pregnant, even though this was a first deployment, there was a lot of unknowns for my poor wife during the entire deployment. If I'm remembering correctly, I might have been able to call her maybe once or twice, like when we first got there, because when we first got there, we stayed at a big fob for the first month before we pushed out to our area in the boonies. But after that, I didn't talk to my wife, I want to say, for at least a couple months before I got the next opportunity to make a phone call. So that's how separated we were at the time. For my wife, it was basically just, hey, my husband's deployed, I hope he's okay. You know, that's really all it was. She didn't get a whole lot of information about the whole ordeal for months at a time. It wasn't until about halfway through the rotation that I was able to mostly regularly communicate with her. So anyway, so that was the feel going into this, is I was pretty much going to be separated from my family. It had to be a complete focus on the mission at hand. But that's the way it had to be, and that's the way it was. Now I'm going to try to get into what it was like day to day for the rotation, but obviously I'm not going to be able to get into most of the minute details because of OPSEC reasons. And I just don't want to give away information that I'm really not supposed to. So I'm just going to try to give you the wave tops of what it was like being a Cav Scout downrange during 2009-2010. So I mentioned that about a month into deployment, we infilled to a very remote location. And when I mean remote, I mean like remote, man. We pulled into this area, riding in on our strikers. And when we pulled in and drop ramp, I still remember getting off the ramp and diving into dust that was like almost up to my knees. It was so thick. People just weren't out at the location we were at. We were pretty close to a small village, but besides that, you know, this location wasn't really occupied by American forces. If I remember correctly, there might have been one or two tents that were already established, and that was pretty much it. I remember thinking in that moment, all right, this just got real. So our first task as a unit was really to establish a base of operations, establish a place where we could conduct operations to and from and be able to live out of, right? Be able to sustain ourselves for what would be an entire 12 months. So we did that. You know, eventually more and more troops came in. We had some engineer units come in and start building up things. Eventually we had some plywood structures. We had a little HQ building. We had a little gym built up. Eventually we ended up with one of the best defects in the area, which was pretty cool. And about halfway through the rotation, we ended up with chews, which were like small connexes that we shared 2 soldiers per. So living conditions definitely improved. You know, we started off living in one big tent on cots, just sharing it as a unit, and moving into, you know, 2-person chews, all right, where we were sharing those living quarters, and it was much less cramped. So over time, it got better and better. But don't get me wrong, it still wasn't as nice as living at home. To this day, this is probably more of a me problem, but to this day, one of the worst parts about living downrange is that you know, you have to get up and go to the bathroom somewhere. So it doesn't really matter if you're living in a patrol base, if you're living in a tent, if you're living in a chew, or even if you're living in barracks somewhere downrange, you know, you're gonna have to get up, walk outside for an unknown distance, and either go to the wood line, go to a shared bathroom facility to just relieve yourself, like during the night when you're trying to sleep, or even if you're trying to take a shower or whatever. That's one of the most annoying parts for me, but it's not something you can't get over, not a big deal. As far as daily operations went, it was mostly because we were a Cav unit, we went out and we recon the area around our base of operations. And so we would be out for, man, it was like 10 hours at a time. We were just out patrolling, doing village assessments, area assessments, doing KLEs with local leadership, and just figuring out the landscape, the lay of the land, and reporting that information back to the commander. That was one of the main jobs of a Cav Scout, and that's what we were doing. We also did things like border security, where we helped the local police forces with their security at the border. and we did border interdictions. We did OPs, where we would stay out for 48 hours at a time and just stay on guard and stay on lookout to watch for smugglers trying to come in over the border, things like that. And honestly, those missions were the worst because they were just so boring, man. You know, it sounds sexy, but like being out there in the same spot for 48 hours at a time looking at the same shit is, you know, for me personally, can get monotonous really fast. You know, I like to be on the move, and don't get me wrong, we were definitely on the move a lot of times. You know, we were not always mounted either. A lot of times we dismounted and did patrolling like that. That was one of the biggest differences I noticed between the cav world and the infantry world, is that the cav can find themselves remaining stagnant in one place more frequently than the infantry. And it's mostly just because their role's different. You know, cav's all about recon, and sometimes in order to recon effectively, you have to stay stationary and hidden, and you have to do it for a long period of time. Infantry is always on the move. I remember walking through the villages out there, and we were always in very close proximity to the local populace, which in that conflict, as you might already know, the local populace looked just like the enemy, so it was always hard to tell who the enemy was or wasn't, and it just felt like you were always on guard, like you could never let your guard down no matter where you were. And it was a different kind of population there. You know, they don't have the same sorts of amenities or lifestyle as Americans do, so even the kids will look at you a lot differently. You know, they don't have the same sense of security or type of fear as like your typical American kid would. So even though we're all decked out in all this gear and ammo, and we, you know, look more or less scary to them, they didn't really seem to be bothered by that. You know, they'd run right up to you with a big smile on their face, asking for pens or candy or water or Gatorade. They had no problem coming right up to you and getting all up in your business. And obviously that created a lot of problems downrange. I don't remember ever, for us personally, I remember the only time we had an issue with children was at one point they were throwing rocks at us, and I remember like my platoon sergeant took a rock right to the face once from a kid, and he was not happy about that. But we didn't have any other real serious security issues with the kids besides that. But obviously there's a lot more stories out there that people have where the kids would be used by the enemy to conduct operations against coalition personnel. So I never really experienced that personally, thank God. And if we're talking about, you know, real world combat experiences, obviously the whole deployment is considered to be combat deployment. But like I said, the majority of it is pretty boring, pretty monotonous. You're kind of just walking around patrolling or driving around patrolling. Not a whole lot of action. And again, you know, I'll be clear about it. This was a very conventional Army deployment. This is, I would say, from my experience talking with other individuals and having other deployments on my belt and stuff like that, I would say that overall this deployment, my first deployment, was pretty on par with the rest of deployment experiences out there. Now I do have a few punctuated moments during that deployment, and when I say punctuated, I'm referring to moments or times where direct combat was involved, and or there were soldiers who were wounded as a result or were KIA as a result. But there are very few and far in between. And the first one that comes to mind is we were out doing a normal patrol, as we were normally doing, mounted on our strikers. And as we were driving down the highway, it was the norm, the local populace knew that if they saw American or coalition troops driving down the highway, they were to pull over and let us pass, okay? For their safety and our safety, right? Makes sense. Well, this day, everything was going normal. We were driving down the highway, everybody's pulling over, and eventually we came across one guy who was on a motorcycle that was pulling over. Well, instead of staying pulled over, as we were driving forward, he started inching his motorcycle closer and closer to our convoy from the curb. And I can still see this today. He inched closer and closer and was right up on the truck that was in front of me, maybe 50 to 100 meters in front of me. And he blew himself up all over that truck that was right in front of me. It was a VIED. And it was not a small boom. It was pretty big for, you know, a little guy on a motorcycle. And that was really the first time I had ever seen anything like that in my life. That was the first time. And I can still see it in my head pretty clearly today. You know, my first thought was, oh my God, I hope everybody in that truck is okay, because it was pretty big. And my second thought was, oh shit, because I felt like shrapnel coming at us too, and I was just like, oh shit, I hope I'm okay. And honestly, it was really cool because all of our training over the last couple of years kicked in that moment where we knew our own TTPs of what to do in that situation, and we executed, I would say, more or less perfectly. And before you worry about anything more, I can tell you that there was no American troops that were wounded in that incident. The worst that happened out of it was a couple blown tires on the Striker, and some, and I think one of the blast shields for the driver's hatch was damaged. But that was pretty much about it. Besides that, as far as we were concerned, that was one enemy KIA that day. But again, that was a pretty substantial experience for me, because that's when it really sank in that, wow, you really could die out here, and there really is an enemy out here that's trying to kill you. Because like I said, the majority of days it's pretty complacent. You know, I hate to say it like that, but it's true. You know, there's not a whole lot of action, there's not a whole lot of, you know, proof out there to show you that there's a constant enemy threat. It's just kind of punctuated with these small events over time. And there was other events throughout that deployment. There was a time when we were convoying through to another village, and there was an IED that a truck hit that was in a rivet. It hit it so bad that the blast came through the ramp, and unfortunately it wounded a couple personnel that were standing in the back of the truck. It wounded them very badly. I don't want to talk too much on it for their sake, but it was definitely something that sent them home and ended their careers. There was another one that was similar to that with another platoon that went out. One of their trucks had ran over an IED, and it wounded the driver real bad, sent him home. We had some minor pop shot instances where I wouldn't say there were full-blown firefights, but you know, there was somebody shooting at us. We just wasn't really sure where it was coming from, so we weren't just like shooting back all the time. Because back then, the ROE, I mean, to roll it up as simply as I could put it, is you weren't to shoot until you were shot at and you could positively identify the enemy. So that was really hard to do, and the enemy expounded on that. Like, they understood that. So, you know, a lot of times we'd take pop shots and not even know where it was coming from. So very rarely was it a clear-cut firefight or you knew who you were shooting at. But that's really how it went for that deployment. It was mostly business as usual, long days, patrolling, doing your best to pull security, a lot of daydreaming, to be honest. And then all of a sudden, wham, you know, something kicks off. And it doesn't last very long, and then it's over, and then it's back to however long it's gonna be until the next one. And like I keep saying, I think that theme is the norm across the board for most combat MOSs out there during that time. I know there was definitely some units out there that found themselves in some more extreme combat scenarios and more frequent combat scenarios, but you guys let me know, you know, who has real experience with this. Does what I'm saying resonate with you? If you know what I'm talking about, am I right with that? Because that's just what I think. And again, I can really only speak from my experience in that unit at that time. And that was my first deployment. Now, about 6 months in to this deployment, I was able to go on R&R, and I did my best to try and schedule it that way. You weren't always guaranteed on when you were going to get your R&R, or even if you were going to get R&R, but I did my best to schedule it that way because I was trying to be back home for when my daughter was going to be born. So I went home, flew back from Afghanistan from deployment for 2 weeks to go see my family and my pregnant wife. And even then, it's hard to adjust back to normal life and normal living conditions, even just after 6 months. But I think when you're on leave, it's a little easier because you're kind of relieved to be there. And you know in the back of your mind that you're just gonna have to go back here shortly anyway. So I was just treating it like a vacation. And for me personally, I just really wanted to make sure that I was there to see my baby be born. And what happened with me is that almost didn't happen. It was during the last couple days of my leave period where me and my wife were doing everything we possibly can to try and get her to have this baby. You know, we were going on walks, eating spicy food, doing everything we possibly can to get her to go into labor, because it was her due date. She was supposed to be going into labor. And because we knew I was leaving in like less than 48 hours, we ended up going to the hospital and sitting in there and trying some of the things that they wanted us to try to get her to go into labor. And we did a whole lot of different things there too, but long story short, we were there for about 10 hours until
they finally broke her water for her and she had a baby. And I will never forget that moment. Oh my gosh, if you guys haven't been there for when a baby is born, like that is an out of this world experience. I was so grateful to be able to be there for that. And to this day, I feel like I'm really lucky to have been there for when my daughter was born during leave from a combat deployment. Back then, a lot of guys weren't as fortunate as me to have been able to do that. There was plenty of guys where there was just, their babies were being born and they weren't there. So I was really lucky. And because my baby was born so close to the window of when I was supposed to be flying back, I was able to get in touch with my commander, and he allowed me to stay there for a few more days so I could be there for the new baby as much as I possibly could before I had to come back downrange. So thanks to him for that. That was a really awesome opportunity, and I really appreciate it. But after those few days, I left my wife once again for another 6 months to combat. She was there now with 3 more grown children and now a brand new infant, all on her own, with barely any communication from me for the next 6 months. And I've appreciated that more and more over the years. I mean, can you imagine how that must have felt for her, how hard that must have been? And that's why I always think it's really important for, you know, if you ever want to thank a service member for their service, make sure you do the same for the spouses, because they sacrifice just as much, man. It is a joint effort, like without a doubt, okay? Me and my wife have gone through all these experiences, including this deployment, together. It has always been together. It doesn't always seem like it in the moment, you know, especially since you're separated. You know, I was on the complete other side of the planet doing things that she will never know, never see. But the same thing was happening for her. You know, she was on the other side of the planet doing things, going through experiences and hardships that I will never know or completely understand. You know what I mean? So it's a double-edged sword. It's hard for everybody, and we get through this together. And I think that's really important to understand as a military couple. And it's really important to understand from anybody looking in to the military and the military experience. I also got promoted to sergeant while I was downrange. That was pretty awesome, which bumped me up to being a gunner of a Striker. And I was a Mark 19 gunner. So that was pretty awesome. And I had a lot more responsibility, or at least it felt like I had a lot more responsibility, because now I had a team. And career-wise, things were looking good for me. Good enough where I was changing my feelings from doing this deployment and then getting out immediately, and did a complete shift to weighing all my options and eventually deciding to re-enlist. And I had thought about a lot of things. I thought about just getting out. I thought about maybe going into the Coast Guard. I thought that'd be cool because I was just like, man, deployment sucks. You know, this sucks. I do like the military experience, but I don't know if I want to deploy like this anymore. Stuff like that, you know, going through those phases. But I eventually landed on just re-enlisting flat out. And I didn't know better back then, because if I would have known what I know now about this topic, I wouldn't have done it this way. But I re-enlisted as a Cav Scout for another 6 years, and I got a small bonus of, I think, like maybe $3,000, and I got airborne school out of it. And guys, if you're looking at re-enlisting, I wouldn't re-enlist for airborne, or if you do that, that should just be like a little bonus on top of whatever else you really want to re-enlist for. Because if you really want to go to an airborne unit, it's pretty easy to just volunteer for an airborne unit without re-enlisting, you know, so you can get more out of your re-enlistment. That's all I'm trying to say. But anyway, I don't regret that. I just probably could have got a lot more if I knew a little bit more about the re-enlistment process. And I want to say that is really when my interest in fitness began and really took off, because now I knew that I had re-enlisted and I was going to go into the airborne. And I thought, because I was just, you know, a very basic soldier at the time, who was just sort of getting by every day as best he could, I thought that airborne was like a super high speed and difficult school. I didn't know. I had no idea. How would I know? So I said to myself, I need to prepare for airborne because I'm not going to fail this. I want to be successful here. So I started running all the time. I went to the gym all the time. Anytime I wasn't on mission, I was in the gym. I did a lot of research on how to properly work out. I started doing a lot of research on supplements. I started taking a lot of supplements, probably some supplements I didn't need to be taking, to be honest, but hey, live and learn, you know? And my fitness level really started taking off at that point. So much where I was banging out a 300 APFT score by the time I got back home from deployment. When I went to airborne school, I got a 300. I got an extended scale of over 300 at airborne school itself. So I was taking PT really seriously. I ended up staying in Afghanistan doing all those things for an entirety of 12 months. Didn't get extended, thank God. A lot of guys, a lot of units back then were getting extended upwards to 15 months. You know, that would suck. I know some stories from guys that were packed all ready to go home and then last second told to turn back and go back to their outstations so they can remain deployed for an additional 3 months. Could you imagine that? That must have sucked. But that didn't happen for me. We just did 12 and done, went home, and then it was all about readjusting to normal life again, which, to be honest, I don't think you're ever the same after a combat deployment like that, regardless of how much punctuation there was or wasn't, because you're so separated from reality. And for an entire year, you know, you got to understand that a whole year being separated from what you know is reality, and then you come back and you are now forced to go back to the way things were. I don't think you ever really truly do, to be honest. You just have to do your best to adapt or learn from that year of life, take all that, and then now hopefully you have to figure out a way to make yourself a better person from that experience. You know, and there's a lot of hard things that you go through on a deployment like that. There's a lot of things that I'm just not going to mention on this video. I didn't mention just because I don't want to give the wrong opinion. I don't want to not be able to give enough clarification or detail in regards to some incidents where, you know, it can be taken out of context. And for me personally, I've always just tried to reflect on those experiences and the experience as a whole, that entire 12 months, and just take what I learned, the lessons learned from that experience, and do my best to grow from it and use it as additional tools that I can now store into the toolbox that I can use in my life, that I can draw from in my life. So even though I will say that that first deployment in my career was not, you know, the most eventful for me personally, I did experience a lot of growth, and it really did set the trajectory for me in my career. It basically slingshot me into a whole new career after coming home from that deployment, and taking all that newfound knowledge and experience that I gained from it and putting it forward and making decisions based on that. And so far, I have no regrets from all the decisions that I've made since then. Now, I think I've talked your ears off enough on this one, guys. Hopefully I got enough information out there for this video to be useful to you. The next video will also be about a combat deployment, but it's gonna be circled around how I earned my Purple Heart. And I want to make a video solely on that, because that experience for me was a huge life changer. The whole situation and everything since then has really, that changed my whole outlook on life, and I think it's worth making an entire video over, and hopefully it will inspire you guys as I go through it. Okay, so that's the next video that we can look forward to. Don't forget to let me know what you thought about some of the things on this video, if you agree or disagree, if it's what you thought or not what you thought, whatever, man. Let me know what you guys think. Talk about it in the comments. You know, this is all about community, and I'm just really trying to tell these stories to motivate you guys, hopefully inspire you guys, and just share some information with you if you wanted to know about this kind of thing, you know? So it's all supposed to be useful. It just should be a good thing. But now I think I'm gonna go ahead and enjoy the rest of my ruck out here in the beautiful weather. I don't think the wind was too bad during this video, so that's a good thing. So besides that, I've got nothing else for you, and I'll see you on the next one.